Hello, this month's programme comes from the Royal Greenwich Observatory in London, where one of the biggest telescopes of its kind is housed, the magnificent 28-inch refractor. It was installed by the 8th Astronomer Royal, Sir William Christie, in 1893. The Royal Greenwich Observatory was set up in 1675 by King Charles II, who installed the first Astronomer Royal, John Flamsteed, who began the task of studying the moon and stars in order to find a means of measuring longitude, so that seafaring mariners would not get lost while at sea. The Greenwich Observatory is the oldest museum anywhere in the world and is steeped in history. If you do visit London, please find the time to visit the observatory, as there is so much to see. There are astronomical instruments dating back to the 15th century, and you can also visit the John Harrison Planetarium. I am most grateful to Press Officer Emma Gough and Dr. Louise Devoy, who made this month's programme possible, two enthusiastic members of staff at Greenwich who certainly made this month's programme that extra special. The time leading up to the establishment of the 28-inch refractor is fascinating. In February 2016, I made a programme called The Story of the Reflector, in which I introduce you to Victorian astronomer William Lassell. William Lassell was born in Bolton in 1799, a Lancashire town west of Manchester, and educated at Rochdale. After the death of his father, he was apprenticed for several years from 1814 to a merchant in Liverpool. He then made his fortune as a beer brewer, which enabled him to indulge his interest in astronomy. He built an observatory at his house he named Starfield in West Derby, a suburb of Liverpool. There, he had a 24-inch reflector telescope, for which he pioneered, with the help of James Nasmyth, the use of an equatorial mount for easy tracking of objects as the Earth rotates. He ground and polished a mirror himself, using equipment he constructed. In 1854, the observatory was moved further out of Liverpool to Bradstone. However, observing with his telescope was not as convenient as with Nasmyth's 20-inch, because the length of the telescope tube was almost 37 feet, nearly as long as William Herschel's of the same size, and Lassell had to perch himself in a wooden tower that enabled him to reach the top of the tube, and could be carried around the telescope as the tube moved. Unlike previous owners of large telescopes, Lassell spent a great deal of his time on the solar system, hunting for additional satellites of the planets Saturn, Uranus and Neptune. In 1846, Lassell discovered Triton, the largest moon of Neptune, just 17 days after the discovery of the planet. In 1848, he independently co-discovered Hyperion, a moon of Saturn, and in 1851 he discovered Ariel and Umbriel, two moons of the planet Uranus. In 1883, soon after becoming the 8th Astronomer Royal, Sir William Christie was offered as a gift William Lassell's 24-inch reflector by Lassell's widow. The telescope was gracefully accepted by the Admiralty, who footed the bill for a new dome, which was erected near the Magnetic Observatory at the south end of the Greenwich Observatory site, where it was put to good use for the observation of faint comets and planetary moons. One of William Christie's aims was to further develop the program of determination of proper motions of the stars with the aid of a spectroscope, which had been commenced in 1875 with a 12.8-inch Mertz refractor. The Mertz telescope was installed in 1859 under the 7th Astronomer Royal, Sir George Biddell Airy, as the first of the large equatorially mounted telescopes at Greenwich. It was a refractor with an aperture of 12.8 inches and an object glass made by the Mertz Company of Munich. The enormous mounting was designed by Airy himself, and the telescope was installed in a new, specially designed building known as the Great Equatorial Building, or the South East Dome, until 1891. The Mertz telescope had proved too small to allow anything but the brightest stars to be observed, and the newly acquired Lassell telescope, although more powerful, was unsuitable as its mounting and clockwork drive was not capable of carrying a heavy spectroscope. Christie therefore set about trying to procure a larger refractor. He was also motivated by the fact that at that time there were 30 national or private observatories with refractors larger than those at Greenwich. In 1885, he secured agreement from the Admiralty to provide the funding to allow him to replace the Mertz with a larger 28-inch refractor on the same mounting. The proposed new telescope was about 3 meters longer than the old, with a diameter at its widest point of 36 feet. The dome was 5 feet wider than the tower on which it stood. It was completed in April 1893, though originally without the crown, which was added in 1907 or 8. The telescope itself became operational at the start of 1894. A few days ago, I went along to the Royal Greenwich Observatory to meet Dr. Louise Devoy, who is the curator. Dr. Devoy was kind enough to show me around the observatory and tell me something about the former equatorial telescopes that was there, and then we had a look at the 28-inch refractor telescope. Welcome back to Astronomy in Space, Louise.
Great, yeah, thank you for coming back to the observatory.
This is a camera obscura. Was an original telescope installed here at one time?
That's right. So this is the northeast summer house of Flamsteed House, at the oldest part of the observatory. And back in 1816, there was an equatorial telescope installed here, known as the Shugborough telescope, because it was originally made for Sir George Shugborough, who had an estate up in Warwickshire. And after his death, the telescope was given to the observatory. And this was the first chance that the observatory had to really start using these equatorial telescopes. For the first century of the observatory's work, from 1675 onwards, the astronomers here have been focused very much on positional astronomy, so using telescopes aligned on a meridian and using these to try and collect astronomical data that could be used to improve navigation at sea. But obviously with an equatorial telescope you can now point the telescope in any direction across the sky. You can use it for observing occultations, comets, eclipses, all sorts of events where you're not restricted to being on a meridian. So it was a really useful instrument.
And even Lassell's telescope was here at one time.
Yes, that's right. So that was installed just south of here. Had its own separate dome, specially made for it. Again, that was a gift, and that was used also for astrophotography.
William Christie?
Yes.
Because he was more keenly interested in observational astronomy rather than looking for the transit telescopes.
Exactly, yes. He was very keen to take on new technologies like astrophotography and spectroscopy, and he wanted to make sure that Greenwich remained at the cutting edge of astronomical research in the late 19th century, and we'll certainly see that when we look at the Great Equatorial Telescope.
He was certainly interested in the stars, the colour of the stars and the spectra of the stars.
That's right, yes. So spectroscopy, developed in the 1860s, was a new way of splitting starlight, and from those patterns you can work out the chemical composition of the stars. So this was really innovative technology that you could use to answer the big questions about what stars are made of.
Shall we go along and see the main telescope?
Yes, absolutely, yep. So the Shugborough was the first equatorial telescope here, with just an aperture of, say, just 4 inches. But later on we'll see the Great Equatorial Telescope, which has an aperture of 28 inches. A huge improvement.
It is. So William Herschel was a very famous astronomer, and he discovered Uranus in 1781, and then he went on to build much bigger telescopes.
Yes, Herschel was very much an accomplished telescope maker as well as a practicing astronomer, and Herschel was also a regular guest here. We know from the records of the 5th Astronomer Royal, Neville Maskelyne, that Herschel and his sister Caroline used to come here for dinner parties. Neville Maskelyne also referred to Caroline as his sister in astronomy. So a very nice working relationship, and Herschel made many different telescopes. In terms of actually using them, I think he preferred using his smaller 20-foot telescope, similar to the one he would have used for the discovery of Uranus. But this really was a masterpiece, a very impressive piece of work that was the largest telescope in the world at that time. Yes, so it was made what we call a speculum, so very carefully polished, very laborious process that took Herschel many hours. And then the telescope was moved around on an elaborate framework and sort of track-like system, and then it said that he would then call out some of the results to Caroline, who'd be in the house, faithfully taking notes, and she herself obviously discovered several comets as well.
Yes. It must have been a very impressive telescope if this is just the bottom end.
Yes, this is just about a quarter, so yes, it's quite mind-boggling to think how big the overall instrument would have been, especially with all the framework around it as well. And it was so big, in fact, that it was even mentioned on Ordnance Survey maps as an object in its own right.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
So behind us is the 28-inch refractor telescope dome.
That's right, the Great Equatorial building, but it wasn't actually the first equatorial telescope installed on the top there. Back in the 1850s there was an earlier equatorial telescope with a 12.8-inch aperture. That was the Mertz, and it was set up just like this, and you can see here that you'd have the telescope here in the middle, and then it was surrounded by a wooden drum-shaped dome, very different to the onion dome that we have today. But this really shows you the equatorial mount. So you've got your north pier here, you've got the axis aligned with the axis of the Earth, and then the body of the telescope is moving parallel to the Earth's equator, hence the name equatorial.
And what kind of use was this put to?
So this was again used for occultations, eclipses, specifically used for measuring the diameters of the planets as well. And you can see here that there's an observer's chair, so the astronomer would be sitting on this chair just here, looking into the eyepiece, and the whole chair structure swings around the floor. And when we go up to see the inside of the dome shortly, you can still see these tracks in the floor where this apparatus used to swing round.
Oh, lovely. What kind of how much did the telescope cost when it was installed?
I think it was several £1,000s, so a huge sum of money at that time. And the whole dome itself was made from wood and also rotated on these sort of cannonballs to help it move smoothly. And then you'd have the opening here to enable them to see out.
It's a very grand telescope.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Very good quality lens made by Merz in Munich. And then the rest of the setup, the Equatorial mount itself was made by Ransones and Sims, whom George Biddle Airy was already familiar with from his previous work with the Airy Transit Circle. And then you also had other components made by Troughton and Sims, again another well-known instrument making company.
So what was it that made this telescope obsolete in that time?
In some ways it's keeping up with the Americans. So by the 1880s, other observatories in the United States were getting bigger and bigger telescopes, and by that time William Christie was now the 8th Astronomer Royal, and he wanted to make sure again that Greenwich was really keeping up to date with all the latest technology, and so he persuaded the Admiralty to pay and invest in a new telescope, and that resulted in the 28-inch.
Oh, lovely. So this is a very grand telescope, Louise, a 28-inch refracting telescope.
Yes, the 28-inch installed in 1893, and as you can see they've reused the original Equatorial mount that was used for the Merz 12.8-inch refractor. So the telescope is sort of aligned here with the Earth's axis, and then the tube rotates parallel to the Earth's equator. It was designed by Howard Grubb of Dublin, a well-known telescope-making company, and then the lens was made by the Chance brothers in Birmingham, and it was initially hoped that this telescope could be used for astrophotography. So when they were designing the lens, they opted to go for a crown and flint configuration, the idea being that you could adjust this or even swap the lenses around to reduce chromatic aberration. But given that the lens was about 35 kilos in weight, it was hugely difficult to try and do this, so it wasn't really used for that purpose. And instead it was used more for observing double stars or binary systems, because it had a really good resolving power, so you could really see the distinction between the two stars and then use that difference to calculate their masses.
And how long was the telescope used? Was it used right the way up to the 1960s?
It was used up until the outbreak of the Second World War. So September 1939, just as war was declared, the lens was actually taken away and stored in some caves down in Kent for safekeeping. And it was a very wise decision, because later in July 1944, a V1 doodlebug exploded just outside here and damaged the dome.
Yes, I've seen all the damage and all the holes in the dome roof.
Yes, it was just consisting of a papier-mâché dome, and so of course it just caught fire and was very badly damaged.
And it was William Christie, the Astronomer Royal, who had a hand in designing the telescope.
Yes, Christie was the driving force behind this, and really wanted to make sure that the observatory had the best equipment available at the time.
at 28 inches. This must be one of the largest telescopes in Europe or even the world.
Yes, even today it's still in the top 10 refractors in the world, because it came in at towards the end of the refractor period. Telescopes are moving towards larger and larger reflecting types instead, because it was just so difficult to make the lenses. Even this lens took 8 years to make. It was just becoming more and more difficult to get the lens size without any imperfections. And so yes, it really is still an impressive record breaker even today.
Do you still have any of the observations that was made for the telescope?
Yes, we still have our public observing programme, but it's not used for research purposes.
No. This is a new kind of equatorial telescope that was installed here.
Yes, so I mentioned that the 28-inch refractor wasn't ideal for astrophotography because of that complicated crown and flint system. So instead, astrophotography was done using some other telescopes, again on a large scale. So there were 2 telescopes installed in that dome. That dome itself was originally situated down here and housed the Lassell telescope, so a donation from Lassell in the 1880s, and eventually that dome was then put onto this building when it was constructed in the 1890s. So you had 2 telescopes, a 26-inch refractor and a 30-inch reflecting telescope, paid for by Thomson, who was a wealthy London surgeon with a very keen interest in astronomy, and these 2 telescopes acted as sort of counterweights for each other on that mounting.
So they're both installed in the same mounting and used for photography.
Yes, I mean that's the beauty with equatorial mounts. With your traditional transit telescope, you're in a fixed position and you've got to wait for the stars to cross your field of view. But with an equatorial mount, you can actually track the stars, assuming you've got some sort of clockwork drive, whether it's water powered or electric powered. You can actually take very long exposures, which is ideal for photography, particularly if you're trying to image very faint objects like nebulae or galaxies. So astrophotography really took off with these very large telescopes on these equatorial driven mounts.
Are the telescopes still inside the dome?
No, unfortunately. The telescopes were taken down to Herstmonceux in Sussex along with the 28-inch, and they're still there today. I believe they're still in working order. The dome itself was converted into a planetarium during the 1960s, and today it's just used as a very nice meeting room.
Oh. It's a very, very grand and very impressive building.
Yes, from the 1890s in this very elaborate terracotta style. And if you look closely, you can see the names of different astronomers and instrument makers. So we've got Wren, Horrocks, Newton, Adams, all of these names inside the terracotta design. Really, really beautiful. Right up at the top there, the first Astronomer Royal.
I can't even see it. This is recording.
Yeah, they were actually planning to demolish this in the 1950s. They thought it was hideous, so I'm glad they didn't.
Thank you.
Tom. What's the spiky one again? With the yellow thing. Trying to imagine what the building is with the pyramid on its top. Where's the shard when he's at home?
Quite nice actually to get the knife.
Well, you can't see the shard from here then. Or can you? One of those.
Well, thank you very much for showing us around the Royal Greenwich Observatory. It was very interesting and very impressive.
Great, thank you very much, Richard, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future.
And thank you for joining us on Astronomy in Space.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The Royal Greenwich Observatory is a fascinating museum to visit if you find yourself in London with a few hours to spare. It is educational for the children and there are lots to see. And you might also like to visit the John Harrison Planetarium. That is all we have time for this month. Thank you for watching. Please visit our website, Astronomy in Space blogspot, where you can watch all of our past shows, and if you like this program, please share it with your friends and members of your local astronomical society. Until we come back next month, good evening.